Hey there. Thanks for listening to the Star Lores podcast. The background track on this episode is called Art of Silence by Eunuch. Make sure to check them out. Also, don't forget to give us a 5-star rating and review on iTunes, as well as subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And make sure to check out our Patreon to become a supporting listener.
You are listening to the Star Lores podcast.
I find your lack of faith disturbing.
Are you stuck-up, half-witted, scruffy-looking nerf herder?
But I was going into Toshi Station to pick up some power converters.
The Distant Sun.
We stepped out of the cramped reek of our interstellar prison into the light of an unfamiliar sun.
Sorgius Zin, circa 6900 BBY.
When a star of sufficient mass dies, the remaining elements not used for nuclear fusion are expelled into surrounding space by the pressure wave of a supernova after the star collapses. Propelled by stellar wind, those unused elements are dispersed to a wider and cooler form than they had been prior to the nova. As time goes on, they cool and their journey through interstellar space decelerates. The forgotten elements coalesce into massive clouds that stretch across light years. Nebulae are born. Some nebulae are luminous and beautiful clouds with diameters reaching hundreds or thousands of light years. The local environment of the supernova will determine the composition and characteristics of individual nebulae. In some elementally rich clouds, molecular clouds form. These pockets of more dense material are rich with ionized gas in the form of hydrogen, helium, and other heavier elements. These are the building blocks of new stars. What is, in effect, the cadaver of a dead star becomes the nursery for infant stars. Each star potentially has planets and can support life. The elements that constitute nebulae can act as shrouds for the region of space they cover, occluding them from sensors. Some nebulae present difficulties for more technology than long-range sensors. One so populated nebula is the Stygian caldera in the Outer Rim region. It encompasses hundreds of light years, but the bulk of the elemental cloud's molecules form a shape similar to the crater around a volcano. For some reason, the more gas-dense regions of the caldera are difficult to pass through at hyper-relativistic speeds, and typical hyperspace routes through it must take advantage of less elementally dense corridors in the nebula. Horuset, an unremarkable star system in the S-Trans sector, lies at one of the Stygian caldera's few navigable corridors. For this reason, the Dragon's Tail hyperspace route passes through the Horuset system, ringing the inner edge of the caldera and passing through dozens of populated systems. The Dragon's Tail has become the primary trade route through this benighted sector. The eponymous star in the Horuset system appears to be of the mass and luminosity most often observed to support planets with ecosystems. Unlike millions of other similar stars in the galaxy, only one planet orbits Horusset. Korriban and her 7 moons dance alone around their star in this isolated section of space. The 2 debris belts that share the embrace of Horusset's gravity allude to the conflict so endemic to its one rocky world. Called the Ashes of Kor and the Korriba Scar, they hint at possible early mythological conceptions the Sith people had about their world, as though Korriban itself was the body of a primordial deity, and the debris fields are pieces of the divine Soma, separated from the whole in combat with a being who fled into the deep void in which the planet hangs. When later Sith groups settled the Yavin system, they developed a mythology which placed the gas giant Yavin as the primary deity, lending possible precedence to a pattern of deifying celestial bodies in Sith tradition. Korriban has been a desert world for most of its documented history. In these conditions, one might expect to see evidence of meteorite impacts pockmarking the surface, particularly in a system with 2 asteroid belts. Other than mountainous regions, or those marred by deep canyons and gorges, Korriban's surface is relatively unblemished. Perhaps the moons absorb the bulk of the impacts from the debris belts. It is thought by some that the ancient Sith culture's forced traditions may have contributed to the world's present harsh, arid ecosystem, but this remains speculation. The presence of dark side animals, such as the Hissis or the Tarantatek, do provide some plausibility for this idea. This pattern of the dark side's direct influence on biology is perhaps its most pernicious aspect, and indeed was the source of the second schism in the Jedi Order. Creatures who have had their DNA directly altered by the dark side seem to be universally predatory and aesthetically threatening. Their appearance communicates instantly to any sentient that they are on the menu. The Tukata, for example, were selectively bred over many generations by the Sith for both their force sensitivity and aggression, in addition to a dizzying arsenal of natural weapons. They had 3 rows of razor-sharp teeth, poisonous barbs, and large talons. Additionally, these tetrapods were extremely muscular and grew to about the size of a horse.
The Overlords.
The Sith have existed for well over 100,000 years. Over that barely imaginable space of time, many Sith magicians emerged with the might of the dark side grasped firmly in their hands. Jedi Master Ood Banar.
The word Sith likely conjures images of red lightsaber-wielding figures, dressed in ominous black, with a voice strained through a machine. Perhaps a ghoulish figure with yellow irises, sending arcs of deadly lightning from his fingertips. Preceding these 2 widely known images are the Order of Sith Lords, a shadowy cabal of 2 powerful mages and their fanatically loyal, or else cruelly manipulated minions, plotting over millennia to destroy the Republic and annihilate the Jedi. Located further down this historical ladder are several incarnations of visible Sith empires, including, in descending chronological order, the reconstituted Sith, Revan Sith, and finally, the Old Sith Empire. Sith, for most beings in the galaxy, has become synonymous with evil, cruelty, and malice. The precise meaning of Sith has changed over the eons, and its etymology is controversial. Some believe that it comes from the language of the Sith species, while others think it was co-opted from the Rakatan language. At one point in Korriban's history, a single species of primate is known to have existed. Although it is a reasonable hypothesis that this is an ancestor of the Sith species, a definitive link has not been established. The typical crimson-skinned Sith are similar to humans in many respects physically. Divergences from the anthropoid body form include tentacles hanging from their cheeks and a variable hand and foot composition that constituted of 3 to 5 digits. The facial tentacles had unique patterns of psychomotor activation and conveyed emotions in a manner analogous to facial expressions. It has been well documented that Sith-human copulations produced viable offspring with relative ease, a rarity in cross-species hybrids. Hybridization eventually became extremely important in the final epoch of Sith history. Sith likely exist still as fractions of DNA in various human populations scattered throughout the galaxy. Like humans, the Sith have an unusually high prevalence of Force sensitives in their population. Although commonly thought of as either violent barbarians or evil wizards, they were initially just as capable of emotions like sympathy or loyalty. That is, until horrific eugenics programs succeeded in breeding out the biological underpinnings of such pro-social emotions late in their history. While humans have a majority of right-handed individuals, the Sith were primarily left-handed. Force sensitivity was actually the norm, rather than the exception. Once more contrasting against the most well-known Force-using species, the Sith seem to have a predisposition toward using the dark side of the Force. While extant, the Sith were genetically diverse species that consisted of up to 6 distinct subspecies: the Kasai, the Masasi, the Zugaruk, and an unnamed enslaved variety, and simply the Sith. Human Sith hybrids did not emerge until the twilight of Sith history, near the traditionally accepted date of their extinction. By 3730 BBY, the declining Sith Empire was 97% human with Sith heritage. In the feudal society that developed on Korriban from circa 100,000 to 30,000 BBY, each subspecies formed a caste in the Sith's rigid social strata. The Masasi were taller and more massive than other types, had yellow eyes with no visible pupils or irises, and were the warrior caste. When Naga Sadao fled to the Yavin system with his Masasi warriors, he began a program of genetic and alchemical manipulation of the already fearsome subspecies. By the time he was finished, they were hardly recognizable. His magic twisted the Masasi phenotype to a hulking and vicious breed of dark side warrior. The Yavin Masasi displayed a marked hypertrophy of muscles in their shoulders and neck, leading to a hunched posture in comparison to other Sith. The Kasai subspecies were visibly closer to the Sith, and were distinguished by horizontal rigid face tentacles, as well as bone spurs protruding from their eyebrows. Zugaruk were distinguished by a more diverse palette of skin pigmentation, and occasionally pentadactyl as opposed to more common tridactyl of other subspecies. Magic is of primary importance to the influence that Sith eventually had on the course of galactic history. With this mysterious collection of ritualistic practices, perfected and passed down over countless centuries, the Sith were able to twist the very nature of the Force to their own ends. Although many cultures have independently developed Force traditions apart from those first refined by the pilgrims from Tython, Sith magic is a singular case. Very few other species have the ubiquitous prevalence of force sensitivity displayed by the Sith, combined with a prevailing worldview that prized conflict and domination.
Reign of the Axe.
More than 25,000 years ago, the Sith were united by the long-lived King Addis, who led the revolt against the Rakata invaders, and subsequently acquired Rakatan technology. Sevis Va.
Before becoming hyperspace capable, Sith society consisted of groups of clans that associated with one another on the basis of shared ancestry, forming tribes. Intertribal warfare was virtually perpetual, assisted by each tribe's dark side sorcerers. During this era of perpetual warfare, a prophecy rose to prominence, telling of a charcoal-skinned warrior who would unite the Sith people. In one of these tribes, a Sith male with such skin pigmentation named Addis was born. This was considered an auspicious omen. He grew to an imposing, heavily muscled size, but was equally gifted intellectually. A prodigy in magic, talented tactician, and merciless warrior. He was bound for greatness. Having mastered the martial and magical arts, Addis constructed an enormous enchanted axe. The destructive potential of the weapon was threefold. He could smash and chop through the bodies of foes with its blades, shoot laser beams from it, and use it as a kind of superweapon to summon force storms. Axe in hand, Addis raised an army and embarked on a bloody conquest of Korriban, eventually succeeding in uniting all tribes and ruling them as king. His people would eventually name him Sith'ari, the perfect being, the supreme overlord. During his reign, he came to be considered a god, and many Sith rulers who followed took the throne believing themselves to be the same. The quote, reign of the axe, as Addis's rule became known, was a period of unprecedented peace on Korriban. After ruling for 3 centuries, Rakatan envoys from the Infinite Empire made first contact with the beings of Korriban. The Infinite Empire attempted to integrate themselves to the king using flattery and instructing him in further techniques of force manipulation. The Rakatans were not visiting Korriban on a mission of peace and goodwill. An invasion force eventually landed. Despite being eons behind the Infinite Empire technologically, the Sith drove away the invaders who never returned. Addis, however, was killed in battle, thus ending the reign of the axe with the same kind of violence with which it was born. With the only unified leader the Sith ever had dead, the perpetual state of warfare of the preceding 70 millennia returned.
Gateway to the Empire.
It took weeks for us to understand the power structure of their culture, to undermine it, and to annihilate their current king.
Quote, Sorzus Sin.
Eventually, it became clear to the Sith that no clear victor could emerge from the grim darkness of the war that had engulfed Korriban. The Rakatans had left some of their ships behind in their retreat, and the Sith eventually learned to fly and maintain them. Different factions of Sith then took to the stars aboard these alien starships. Korriban was mostly depopulated in this diaspora, though Kasai's priests stayed behind. Sith rulers would return to the womb of their species to be interred after death in sprawling temple complexes in what they called the Valley of the Sleeping Kings. This necropolis was carved from a sheer canyon and hosted the last remains of important kings. Most of the tombs were decorated with massive sculptures of humanoid figures, sometimes representing the king who slept in the dusty black inside. Other megalithic sculptures were of zoomorphic humanoids with animal heads. Additional statues were depicted wearing robes in uncharacteristically humble poses, their gazes pointed earthward. When they encountered indigenous sentient beings on foreign worlds, the Sith would virtually always conduct a swift and brutal conquest of the populace. If such an unfortunate species escaped genocide, they were typically enslaved. Slavery itself appears to have been a tradition preserved from the most ancient recesses of Sith culture, and was practiced with chilling brutality until their extinction. Enslaved beings were often deeply scarred psychologically and physically, and lived their lives in a state of perpetual fear of their masters. The first world colonized by the Sith after Korriban was Ziost, prior to the onset of its present Ice Age. From here, they colonized Malachor V, which went on to shape galactic history, and was host to the infamous Traus Academy. Since the Empire's collapse, Malachor V has suffered several cataclysmic events, though still manages to support a nominal ecosystem. The perpetually gloom-soaked world of Dromund Kaas and its lightning-scarred sky would eventually become the capital of the later true Sith Empire. Other worlds in the Stygian caldera, such as Nathema, supported only small populations that worked in agriculture and fed the rest of the Empire. Even this humble farm world could not escape the destructive nature of Sith magic, and has been permanently damaged in some difficult-to-quantify way by it. Most reports from the world come from Force adepts, not visiting for scientific purposes, but they convey interesting qualitative data about the negative mental effects the world has on them. Almost without exception, these formerly Sith worlds have become powerful nexuses of the dark side of the Force since their inhabitants passed on. These planets are haunted until present day, with visions and hallucinatory whispers from beyond the grave, and stalked by Force ghosts of would-be sith'ari. Although Force sensitives are particularly vulnerable to a variety of pathologies at such dark side nexuses, almost all beings react in some way to the dark ether that clouds these grave worlds. Sith civilization, now spanning most of the inhabited worlds in the Stygian caldera, remained in a state of disorganized tension and recurring conflict until circa 6900 BBY. Hakagram Grouch succeeded in uniting the Sith tribes once again, presumably after a bloody conquest. He was hailed in his day as the new sith'ari, and the first true successor to King Addis. When exiles from the distant core worlds reached Sith space, they brought with them the only thing that could possibly make the belligerent species more dangerous: a more refined knowledge of the Force and instruction on its use. In the spiritual traditions of the Sith species, the Dark Jedi found much to admire. Despite these shared ideals, the exiles were not initially viewed as the godlike beings that they thought of themselves as. The Sith were perhaps impressed by the aliens' superior technology and force abilities, but not to such a degree as to give them any social power. The exiles infiltrated Sith society and conquered it from the inside out. In so doing, this handful of heretics soon brought an end to the relative peace. Like his predecessor, King Grouch's reign was ended by a Force wielder from a distant world. Ajunta Paul, a dark Jedi exile recently arrived on Korriban, beheaded Grouch using the king's own double-bladed sword. As a result of being ruled by a human, the Sith cultural attitude shifted to a slightly more equitable view of non-Sith sentience. They would tolerate and even treat as equal a select few species, such as humans. Aside from this, however, the invading Dark Jedi preserved the Sith's culture as they viewed it as powerful and complementary to their own goals. The exiles assimilated into Sith society. One of the changes they did bring to the alien culture was a deep hatred and fear of the Jedi and the Republic, transplanted from a series of conflicts known as the 100 Years' Darkness. Though the time preceding first contact with the galactic community was considered the golden age of the Sith, at that specific moment, the throne was contested by two factions, those following Ludo Kresh and those following Naga Sadow. Kresh was the more conservative leader, wishing to preserve Sith culture in its state of relative homeostasis and showing deference to the old ways and traditions. Sadow was more progressive. He believed that the Empire had stagnated and needed to expand, and was fascinated by magic deemed evil or heretical by even Sith standards. In 5000 BBY, hyperspace explorers from the Empress Teta system made contact with the Sith. Eventually, they shared navigational data with Naga Sadow, unleashing the abominable Empire upon the galaxy. After a skirmish with Kresh, Naga Sadow emerged as de facto emperor and led an invasion force into Republic space. His forces were shortly defeated in what history knows as the Great Hyperspace War, though he escaped back to Korriban with some of his armada still intact. Upon returning, however, Kresh's force had regrouped and civil war returned to the Sith. Greatly embittered by their failed expansion, the remnants of the Sith Empire became very insular and isolationist. This was made easy by the belief in Republic space that they were extinct. Through tortuous conspiracies and proxy wars initiated from the shadows, the Sith would have their revenge on the Republic and its Jedi guardians, though their patience had to outlive their species. Their last desperate desire lives on through the beings who have picked up a red lightsaber and taken it to Jedi throats. As far as most xenobiologists and the general public are concerned, the Sith species, like Korriban's one other known primate, are extinct. Traumatized by the Great Hyperspace War, the Mandalorian Wars, and the Jedi Civil War, the Republic eventually passed legislation banning the dissemination of information regarding the Sith. This campaign against free speech resulted in the once powerful empire and species being relegated to the status of scary stories told to children, which was perhaps beneficial to the beings who had taken up their cause of vengeance in the shadows.
impure knowledge.
But ask me the secrets of Sith alchemy, and I would ask you for 3 measures of blood. 1 from a person you love, 1 from a person you hate, and 1 from yourself.
Naga Sadow.
When the Dark Jedi first arrived on Korriban, scientists like Sorzis Zin, creator of the Mirror Talisman, among other abominations, praised the effectiveness of Sith spells and incantations for channeling the dark side. Prior to their invasion of the Dark Jedi, Sith armies used their most powerful sorcerers as artillery, placing them on the high ground of battlefield or on a fortress battlement, raining curses from a distance at enemy forces. Linguistically, the force techniques used by ancient Sith are often described with the language of sorcery and myth, rather than the more familiar and safe-sounding language used by the Jedi. Rather than recognize the oneness of all things, for allowing the users to become a conduit of the Force, the Sith use technology, mental and physical, to make the Force a conduit of their will. The terms magic and sorcery are often used to refer to all the Sith Force traditions. Specific subdisciplines in this field include alchemy, divination, and perhaps most importantly, necromancy. This may sound like it would lead to individual Sith following their own mind in all things, eschewing established traditions in order to meet their own selfish desires. However, by the time of the Great Hyperspace War, certain traditions were rigidly adhered to. At the funeral of Marka Ragnos, for example, Ludo Kresh served in some capacity as a kind of priest. He wore distinctive robes and ribbons with charms written on them in the Sith language. The funeral procession to the tomb was an organized and elaborate affair, climaxing with the live internment of dozens of slaves in the fallen king's tomb. When Naga Sadow interrupted the ceremony, Kresh was furious. A duel broke out between the 2 sorcerers, in which they utilized their large, highly stylized claymore swords. This in turn woke the dark side ghost of Marka Ragnos, who was displeased at the disunity they were sowing in his empire. Ragnos was not finished playing a role in galactic history, however, and like many of the Dark Lords, returned to the world of the living for brief periods as a dark side phantom. Like many Force users, the Sith were occasionally able to glimpse the future through the Force. Whether they used specific techniques such as the recitation of incantations or other rituals, or the visions came unbidden, is not clear. Typically, necromancy, or communicating with the dead, is simply another method of divination. Spirits of the dead are called on to give special knowledge about the future or even information about the present that the ghosts have special access to. In the case of Sith, however, it was a more diverse field. It included the creation of the fearsome Korriban zombies by Dathka Garrosh and essence transfer as a way to escape chaos, a kind of afterlife where the spirits of Darksiders sometimes wind up. Some prominent Sith even went on to have a kind of second career, essentially becoming overlords of the strange netherworld. In most magical traditions, alchemy involves changing the physical world in fundamental ways, transmuting substances from one state to another, or achieving immortality. It is the latter that both the Sith species and the Dark Jedi focused on. Dark Jedi alchemy was responsible for the creation of horrific new forms of life, such as the Leviathan, and similar creatures were used in Dark Jedi military operations during the 100 Years' Darkness. Alchemical processes often involved pharmacology to some extent, among many other technologies. At least 2 Sith from the later period of their civilization actually managed to attain immortality through such techniques. The rituals involved both live sentient sacrifice and heavy drug administration over an extended period of time. Immortality came at a heavy price, leading to permanent scars in the Force around entire planets, or causing a constant permanent sensation of pain and misery in the immortals.
And now, a message from our sponsors.
Are you stressed from the constant buzz of the big planet city? Tired of the dreary grays of the plasteel jungle and artificial lights of the sublevels? Have you yearning for open skies? Do you enjoy cloud watching? You could use a relaxing vacation to Cloud City. Enjoy soothing and luxurious spa getaways. Our Ugnaught staff are here to serve your every need. Brought to you by Brisbane Tourism Board. Welcome aboard the Millennial Falcon. We're on the Dragon's Tail hyperspace route. Not exactly sure where we're going. We're just taking a leisurely flight around the Stygian caldera. You know, we don't want to catch the Korriban zombie disease or whatever.
Or the rat ghoul plague.
Or the rat ghoul plague. I'm not sure if it ever made it to the Stygian caldera.
Well, probably not.
So anyway, just to be clear, Ajunta Paul cut off Hakagram Grouch's head, not Nagasadao. They were separated by a couple thousand years. That's something we got wrong on a previous episode.
Yeah. We'll do a corrections episode, but we seem to keep mixing up Ajunta Paul with Nagasadao. So.
Yes. So another thing, I very briefly touched on the Dark Jedi exiles because although they did certainly interacted a lot with the Sith species and had a lot to do with the development of their culture and galactic history, the Dark Jedi exiles also have their own very involved storylines, several that both precede and then continue sort of after the Sith species, because even their ghosts of a bunch of the Dark Jedi exiles come back in later Star Wars tales, which is an interesting thing that they do. And so another thing, I think it was you who told me that the Sith, LucasArts told the writers of Tales of the Jedi specifically not to base the Sith culture on any.
No, they didn't want to base any cultures to mirror human or like real life history and cultures, and then they went ahead with it anyways and made like space Greeks and space Romans, and then with the
space
Sith,
Egypt.
Exactly, with the Sith they have a very heavy Egyptian influence.
Yeah, Nagasadao in particular, some of the pictures you find of him online, he's like even wearing like a typical
pharaoh crown.
I wonder, like, I think it's so hard to make an original species in any kind of fiction.
Yeah, I mean, even Avatar, it's just like just a
Native
mishmash
Americans. Like, I don't know. I'm even trying to think of, I've read a few science fictions, and it's hard to think of like a truly original species other than Arrival. I think
I was just going to bring up Arrival.
Arrival has an incredibly original species,
although it's really not that original because it's just space squid, which H.P. Lovecraft was doing 100 years ago.
Okay, I suppose that's fair enough, but they're not. Maybe
the way their culture.
Maybe the species was. The idea for the species, but there wasn't, like, squid don't necessarily have like a culture.
No,
not that you know of.
Yeah, not that I'm aware of.
You bigot.
Yeah.
How do you know why they're spraying that ink?
Well, I don't, but yeah, I'm just saying it's more like it's not drawing off of it. It would be, to me, I kind of thought in that particular movie, like it would be. What an alien probably would be more like. It would be alien to us. It would be so alien to it. Totally it wouldn't resemble humans in any way, right?
Yeah. Personally, I do like the cultural mirroring. I like that. I like it.
Yeah. Actually, I don't mind it either myself.
Yeah. No, and I also really like it that this Egypt thing is if you're into like Western occult traditions and like Aleister Crowley or the Church of Satan or the Church of Set or anything, all of these traditions reach back to ancient Egypt, right?
Yeah.
Theosophists and
all of those goofy like Victorian era occult societies in England.
There's a very strong tie between occultism and Egypt. I'll call it a pseudo-Egyptology because it's not even like a true...
Even in the Bible, though, it's like that's sort of the source of ancient evil magic, right? There's
it's
Moses having wizard duels with
pharaonic priests.
With pharaonic priests, right?
Yeah, it's true. And I think there are like a lot of other...
No, it wasn't Moses. It was Aaron, right?
Right, yeah.
My mistake.
You confuse them like a Juntapal.
But even like, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Stargate, like that pulls heavily from Egyptian mythology as well.
Yeah, you can see it even like the Conan mythos. They have ancient Stygia, which is Egypt, and same occultic worship of Set and all that.
Egypt is a good like inspiration for
but then I like that they didn't.
Cultures.
It clearly influenced by Egypt, but then especially in Tales of the Jedi, aesthetically, like their clothes and stuff is very sort of Conan the Barbarian style, like sword and sandal type fantasy stuff.
Yeah, well, obviously you got to kind of do your own thing with it. You can't just be a carbon copy.
Yeah. Except for the Valley of the Kings. Is also straight up.
That is literally a carbon
I think
copy.
it's Valley of the Hidden Kings, though.
So different, so unique.
There's one extra word.
I'm sure there's a Sith whose name is like Tutankhamun somewhere.
Tulak Horde.
Yeah, there you go.
Another thing is about the Sith biology and sort of difficult ideas about like racial purity and eugenics programs and stuff that runs all throughout the Sith species and a bunch of their stories. And even there's this sort of idea that the species itself was just sort of purely evil. And because that's obviously Revenge of the Sith, right? Like that's ultimately Palpatine is going all the way back to this and sort of carrying out their dying wishes. And then, like I mentioned, it really stuck out to me that from 100,000 to 30,000 BBY, it was just constant warfare on Korriban. It was just all these tribes just constantly
each other,
killing each other with the dark side. And that's like such a brutal statement on history. 70 millennia of just
constant
never-ending warfare is like hard to even conceptualize.
I mean, but to be fair though, like there were Sith who were Jedi, like Sith species who were Jedi.
Yeah, that's true.
Even in the Dawn of the Jedi.
And they could.
But then that's like only because they were
Jedi as well,
because they were kidnapped from their culture, from their native culture.
But it's not like they can't help but be dark side users.
But actually, once the Dark Jedi exiles took over, then they started doing like eugenics programs, and they specifically bred out like the psychological traits of being nice and like helpful.
They're just trying to make them irredeemably evil.
Yeah, exactly.
The other thing too, on that same note, and in regards to their physiology, like the red skin, the horny face, horns on faces, like very like almost pseudo-demonic kind of attempt at an appearance, even though there are also Deveronians who look straight up like traditional artistic depictions of the devil. But
and there are even some depictions in Tales of the Jedi where it almost looks like the Sith have cloven feet as well,
which is an intentional kind of,
which is obviously. And I think I finally sort of had a revelation of a possible read for why the Sith lightsabers are red, is that it's because the Sith species was crimson skinned, I'll say, for reasons.
But even the red, like really in future iterations of the Sith religion, red really is a part of the symbology and stuff of everything.
You'll always see red come up.
And in the Legacy comic line, all the Sith in the one Sith, they tattoo their entire bodies red.
Before we deviate too much from that, also a cool note of their biology is the fact that they're predominantly left-handed.
Yeah,
It's a very
yeah.
sinister.
Did you know that sinister is
Actually comes from left.
the Latin word for left-handed?
Oh, okay.
Sinister and Dexter. Yeah.
Yeah. And also about their hands, it's really funny. I think this is largely just a continuity problem with the comics, but the amount of fingers and toes they have
3 to 5
is like really variable throughout the comics.
artistic.
I think it's just
Maybe it's just the way the species is. Like,
but that's sort of how I read it, is that
Okay.
and because they have all these different subspecies as well, it's sort of
yeah.
It lends itself to
you can read it
variation.
as this is just a really biologically diverse species that has a lot of variation.
Yeah.
Yeah. One thing I kind of like about the sort of the imagination of the Sith, really, of like, so like obviously we're introduced to Star Wars in the 70s and they kind of build on the Sith mythos as far as like their religion, but then they introduce, there's actually like a species prior to the religion. And I think that's actually like a really interesting concept, that it like kind of arises as a species first that goes extinct and then it becomes more of a religion. And it kind of like blurs the line between, people group and religion, kind of like Judaism does,
There's even a diaspora from Korriban.
I'm not making a contrast between Sith people and Judaism. I'm just saying, there,
Like, where does a religion end and where does a people group begin?
Yes. Like, there's plenty of atheistic Jews, but there's also like,
and they would consider
Orthodox
themselves culturally Jewish.
Yeah, they
or
still,
ethnically Jewish.
Yeah,
but not religiously Jewish.
Right. So it's just it seems like it kind of adds just, I don't know, more layer to the to the
it's more complex than just
exactly.
like these guys are all one group and they all believe one thing.
Yeah,
and that's what they are. And this group believes one thing and that's what they are.
Right.
You also see something similar in a future episode we'll touch on with the Mandalorians, but
sure, yeah, totally.
It does happen a couple of times.
Similar contrast there too.
There's another thing I just want to comment about the warlike nature of the Sith, is that this like essentially medieval society managed to fight off the Rakatan Infinite Empire.
Right. Yeah.
Like they are horrifically brutal in combat. Like they
and also the Rakatan Empire was very similar to the Sith in that they were a very warlike species for millennia until the Qua introduced technology to them and the Force as well to them. So the Rakatans, who themselves are kind of similar to the Sith in terms of their culture, like couldn't even beat the Sith.
It's interesting though, because the Rakatans, like they are obviously very warlike and conflict based, but their whole thing is like they're sort of like capitalists on crack or something, whereas the Sith sort of just like to fight. But the Rakatans are about consumption. Like that's literal. They literally eat their foes
and expansion.
And stuff.
Yeah.
And
indefinitely.
they're only expanding so that they can consume more and more worlds.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting little difference. Whereas the Sith are just about fighting and conquering. And
but I also see the Sith as like kind of a very traditional sort of people who have a lot of rituals and stuff like that,
practices that they carry on.
Whereas the Rakatans don't seem to care about that kind of stuff.
No, they're much more like animalistic almost, right? They're just about their insatiable
Base need.
appetite.
Yeah, exactly.
For force-powered starships and whatnot.
Yeah.
So Sorza Zin is a really interesting character. She authored the Sith Code, which is a cool little thing. And then she's just got like millions of awesome quotes in addition to the Sith Code, which we've read a few times. Life itself was in our services. That's another good Sorza Zin. She was sort of like a historian, documented a lot of stuff about Hackogram Grouch getting killed by what's his face, Ajunta Paul. It is funny also how in some of the older Star Wars tales before this period of Sith history was elaborated on, it said that like the Dark Jedi exile were greeted as gods, but then like in retrospect, you see that is very much revisionist history on the Sith Lords' part. Like that's how they wanted to be.
Yeah.
But the Sith were not really impressed by them when they first came. They were just like, yeah, okay, whatever. You got the Force, you got a spaceship.
Yeah.
Big effing deal.
Yeah.
We've been killing millions of people for 70,000 years.
With swords.
With swords. BFD. And so they had to do this sort of clandestine culture war and infiltration of the Sith before they could elevate themselves to that godlike status.
Yeah.
And even the godlike thing, it's like the Sith didn't recognize them as gods because they were powerful per se. They recognized them as gods because they already had this tradition of their head of state being a god.
Yeah.
Like,
also another Egyptian parallel.
Well, in fairness, that's just
and
like,
Roman. And,
I was just going to say, that's
there's a
like,
lot of cultures that do that.
Basically, as soon as you
DFI.
find states, you find god kings. Like,
That's Korea.
Pretty much every single
yeah, it's true.
ancient state, at least, had a god king.
Yep.
Other fun things about the Sith. We got tridactyly, pentadactyly. I just like saying that.
I want to say it would be cool to look more into Sorza's Sin.
Yeah, I think I want to do an episode on her.
Pretty cool character.
Yeah, she's got a lot of interesting stuff about her.
Yeah.
And I also like that she's kind of like an academic.
Yeah.
And this is something that I find with a lot of Sith characters, actually, is like they're super scholarly.
Yeah.
Which is a funny and interesting thing. Like they're all sort of scientists and historians.
They're not just like dumb brutes that are just here to wreck the galaxy.
Almost like a Plagius or a Kreia, characters like that, you know.
Or of course Darth Sidious.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
He spent his whole childhood
learning and being
learning about Sith lore.
I like that. I like that they're like intellectuals, you know, and there's Jedis like that as well. So
yeah, and then there's the whole undead level with their ghosts coming back. And Korriban zombies. Dathka Grouch. This is Hakagran Grouch's brother. He was like a super powerful alchemist, and he like raised whole armies of Korriban zombies and stuff. And then his helmet, I believe, is what Darth Hayes from the Knights of the Old Republic comic book wore. It's this really distinctive helmet with like two big horns coming out off of it. And it's Dathka Grouch, which is just...
The Sith have a lot of artifacts that kind of also outlive them and move on into the future.
Speaking of Sith artifacts, the first Sith holocron, I didn't get to it in this episode, but King Addis, he made the first Sith holocron, but he was taught by the Rakatans. Actually, that was Rakatan tech. And so it's interesting that I believe that means that holocrons as a technology are like a Sith technology that Jedi later...
Just like lightsabers.
That the Jedi...
The Sith are innovators.
Later
Jedi are just cheap copycats.
Exactly.
It's true.
Like, I mean, that's why
the Sith are the only ones really pushing the boundaries of the Force, you know,
of science and technology.
I mean, that's literally it. Like the first schism is the Jedi just didn't like that Zendor was doing something new, and then the second great schism was the same thing. They were mad that the Dark Jedi were creating Leviathans and new forms of life, and they're like,
the Sith are like the Star Wars versions of like the Manhattan Project or something. You know, sure they could, you know, destroy planets with it, but they also have like
they're just trying to
clean
live
renewable energy that's created from it.
Live forever.
Exactly. You just have to like torture live subjects and siphon off.
Eventually, some good will come out of it.
Precisely.
You got to look at the bright side.
On that note, it is interesting, just because of the warlike nature of the Sith, that technology actually is innovated through warfare primarily. If you look at like almost all...
but not with the Sith until the Rakatan came.
Sure. I'm just saying it's an interesting parallel.
And that,
Maybe I'm reading into it.
And at least in Tales of the Jedi, I know there are some other later novels that cover the Great Hyperspace War in more detail, but in Tales of the Jedi, the Great Hyperspace War was kind of not well fought on the Sith's part. They were like rebuffed pretty quickly.
Easily.
Yeah, it was not a terribly successful campaign. And then, like I said, their society was around for 70,000 years and was a feudal society, a medieval society, and that's kind of being generous. For that entire time, they had no technical innovation because I think they were almost hamstrung by the Force. Like, it's almost too powerful.
Yeah, they never need to innovate because they're like,
if you get to that level of sophistication, right?
Yeah, that's probably true. Actually, there's a cool kind of side note history thing is why they claim that, like, there's a theory that why elves don't, because the Tolkien mythos has been around forever too, that elves never push innovation because they don't need to, because they are so long lived and
or immortal,
master magic and everything, that they don't really need to innovate technologically because they're so in tune with their surroundings that it's like, oh, we don't have to. Like, this is a satisfactory level.
I'll just eat my lembas cake or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. Why do you need to, advance tech when you have magic, right?
It's true.
Precisely.
Also disputed in the new Disney movie. Forget what it's called. Oh, starts with an O. But yeah, it's like a fantasy world where technology gets introduced and then it like makes magic dwindle. Anyways, go on.
That's about it. I think we gotta drop out of hyperspace. We're gonna go to Nathema and get really depressed by the dark side essence. And,
everyone has to experience it once at least.
That's about it. May the forks be with you.